She died in agony. At 65, her body was consumed by sores. Her final breath torn from a frame wasted by illness. This was Matilda, the woman destined to be England's queen, yet denied her crown. Forgotten by power, stripped of her birthright, she left this world not as a monarch, but as a broken shadow of what might have been. Born in February 1102, in the quiet village of Sutton-Courtenay, Matilda was not meant for an ordinary life. She was the daughter of King Henry I of England and Matilda of Scotland. And from the very beginning, her destiny was woven into the great tapestry of European power. Unlike most royal children, her childhood was short-lived. Her life was shaped less by play and innocence, and more by the unrelenting demands of politics. At the age of just 12, Matilda's fate was sealed when she was married to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor. A girl scarcely entering her teens was suddenly thrust into the role of Empress, carrying on her young shoulders the expectations of two kingdoms. England saw her marriage as a bridge to the mighty empire on the continent, a connection that promised strength, security, and legitimacy for her father's reign. Imagine her, a child queen in foreign courts, standing amidst towering men in armor, surrounded by the cold marble of imperial halls. She had to learn quickly how to act with authority, to carry herself as though she belonged among emperors and bishops, even when her heart longed for the safety of home. In the eyes of Europe, she was no longer a child. She was the Empress of the Romans. This transformation was more than ceremonial. In a world where women were often relegated to the background, Matilda stood at the forefront of diplomacy, crowned and anointed in the grand cathedrals of Mainz and Cologne. Her presence was symbolic, but it was also profoundly personal. She was the living embodiment of an alliance between kingdoms. The image of Matilda as a 12-year-old empress is haunting. It reflects both the glittering promise of royalty and the harsh reality of medieval politics. From her earliest days, she was no stranger to sacrifice. And though she wore the crown of an empire, the seeds of her lifelong tragedy had already been planted. The tension between power promised and power withheld, between titles given and thrones denied. Matilda's marriage to Henry V was grand, but it was far from fulfilling. In the imperial courts of Germany and Italy, she was respected for her title. But her private life remained barren. The couple had no children, and in a royal world where heirs defined the worth of a marriage, this absence cast a long shadow over her future. When Henry V died in 1125, Matilda was only 23 years old. She had lived more than a decade as empress, commanding dignity and respect. But suddenly she found herself a widow in a foreign land, with no children to secure her influence. For a moment, her future seemed uncertain. But fate, and her father's ambition, would not allow her to fade into obscurity. King Henry I of England had suffered a devastating blow only a few years earlier. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, had drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120. Overnight, the secure succession of the Norman dynasty crumbled. With no male heir, Henry turned his gaze to Matilda. She was his daughter, his blood, his chosen successor. In a dramatic move, Henry demanded his barons swear oaths of loyalty to Matilda as the rightful heir to the English throne. It was a revolutionary step, for England had never before been ruled by a woman. Many nobles swore, but their promises were half-hearted, their loyalty fragile. To them, the idea of a queen regnant was unnatural, even dangerous. Still, Matilda's return to England was filled with a strange sense of destiny. She was no longer the child bride of an emperor. She was now the heir to a kingdom, the woman meant to carry the Norman line forward. Her lack of children with Henry V no longer seemed a flaw. It became a blank slate on which the future of England could be written. Yet beneath this sense of hope lingered unease. Her father's will was strong, but death is the great leveler. When Henry I eventually passed, would his daughter's claim be honored? Or would ambition and betrayal once again sweep the promise of power from her hands? When King Henry I of England died in December 1135, Matilda's destiny should have been secure. She was his only surviving legitimate child, and countless barons had sworn solemn oaths to recognize her as heir. Yet when the moment came, the promises dissolved like smoke. Power in the Middle Ages was not merely about blood. It was about speed, alliances, and the will to seize opportunity. Stephen of Blois, Matilda's cousin, moved faster than anyone else. While Matilda lingered on the continent, Stephen crossed the Channel, rallied support, and claimed the throne as King of England. His charm and generosity won him immediate recognition from the nobility and the church. For Matilda, it was a devastating betrayal. Everything her father had built, every oath sworn in her name, was ignored. England entered what would be remembered as the anarchy, a civil war that tore the kingdom apart for nearly 2 decades. Supporters of Stephen clashed with loyalists of Matilda. Villages burned, fields were trampled under the boots of mercenaries, and castles rose as symbols of defiance. The common people suffered the most, taxed, robbed, and slaughtered as noble families shifted their allegiances in pursuit of survival. For Matilda, this was not simply a fight for a crown. It was a fight for legitimacy, for the recognition of her right as daughter of a king. But medieval England was not ready for a female monarch. Even her supporters often spoke of her claim with hesitation, as though backing her was less about justice and more about political convenience. The hope of a peaceful succession, one that might have united England under her reign, had vanished. In its place stood chaos and resentment. Matilda's name, once synonymous with the promise of continuity, became bound up with images of war, bloodshed, and famine. What should have been her coronation became her condemnation, and as the years passed, the dream of wearing England's crown grew more distant, even as her determination hardened into steel. Years before her father's death, in 1128, Matilda had been married again, this time to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the young Count of Anjou. The match was strategic, designed to bind England's royal line to one of the most ambitious families in France. But what looked like strength on parchment proved bitter in reality. Geoffrey was only 15 when they wed. Matilda was 26. The age gap, combined with clashing tempers, made their union turbulent. Chroniclers wrote of constant arguments, of suspicion and distance between them. Matilda, proud and imperious, often looked down on her young husband, while Geoffrey, fiery and independent, resisted her attempts to dominate. Yet from this unhappy marriage came the future of England. Matilda bore Geoffrey 3 sons, Henry, Geoffrey, and William. It was her eldest, Henry, who would one day wear the crown that had eluded her, founding the mighty Plantagenet dynasty that would shape England for centuries. Still, in her own time, the marriage was a source of pain. She endured rumors of Geoffrey's infidelity and faced long periods of separation. When she returned to England to press her claim, Geoffrey often stayed behind in Anjou, pursuing his own ambitions. Their partnership was political, but rarely personal. Matilda's sense of isolation deepened. Betrayed by her cousin in England, estranged from her husband in France, she was caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither. She was a mother, but also a claimant to a throne, a wife, but also a warrior, a woman, but forced to carry herself like a king. The coldness of her marriage mirrored the coldness of her political reality. Even in her own household, she found little refuge from the storms of ambition. And yet, without this troubled union, her legacy might have ended in silence. It was Geoffrey's bloodline, joined with hers, that ensured England's history would forever bear her mark. By 1139, Matilda was ready to challenge Stephen for the throne. What followed was nearly 2 decades of relentless civil war, a period so chaotic that chroniclers simply called it the anarchy. It was a time when law itself seemed to vanish, and England bled from every corner. Matilda arrived in England with a small force, supported by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester and other loyal barons. Castles became the beating heart of the conflict, each one a fortress to defend or destroy. When Matilda's forces advanced, villages were burned to deny resources to the enemy. Fields of grain were trampled, homes reduced to ash, and peasants left wandering, hungry and afraid. Despite these horrors, Matilda showed herself as a shrewd leader. She negotiated, threatened, and fought with a determination that shocked many who doubted a woman's ability to wage war. Several times, her forces captured strongholds and pressed Stephen to the brink of collapse. In 1141, she even held him prisoner after the Battle of Lincoln, a moment when her crown seemed almost within reach. But victory slipped away. When Matilda entered London to prepare for her coronation, the people turned against her. Chroniclers described her as proud, arrogant, unwilling to bend to custom or mercy. To the common folk, she seemed cold, even cruel, a queen who demanded obedience rather than inspired loyalty. Riots erupted, and Matilda was forced to flee the city in disgrace. Her reputation suffered. Where Stephen's leniency made him weak, Matilda's severity made her feared. Neither ruler could win the trust of the realm, and so the war dragged on. For the English people, it was a nightmare without end. Crops stolen, families broken, the land itself exhausted. Matilda's name became bound to this suffering. Even when she stood inches from the throne, her hands could not close around it. The kingdom slipped further into chaos, and the queen without a crown carried both the hope and the blame. The winter of 1142 brought one of the most dramatic episodes of Matilda's life. Besieged in Oxford Castle by Stephen's forces, her situation was desperate. Supplies dwindled, hope faded, and capture seemed certain. For a claimant to the throne, imprisonment would mean political death. Yet Matilda refused to surrender. On a freezing December night, she staged an escape that became legendary. Clad in white cloaks to blend with the snow, Matilda and a handful of loyal knights slipped out of the castle walls. The landscape was silent, the ground frozen solid, and the night air cut like glass. Step by step, they crossed the icy fields, their figures almost invisible against the endless whiteness. Chroniclers wrote of the eerie silence the enemy guards never suspected. In the dim moonlight, Matilda appeared less like a fugitive and more like a ghost, gliding through the snow toward freedom. It was not only a physical escape, but a symbolic act. A queen denied her throne, vanishing into the night, yet refusing to be erased. They reached the frozen Thames, where the river itself became both barrier and salvation. Carefully, they made their way across the ice, the cracking surface echoing beneath their feet. One slip could have meant death, yet Matilda pressed forward. Her courage in that moment was undeniable. By dawn, she was gone, vanished from Stephen's grasp, her survival a reminder that her cause still lived. The escape from Oxford entered legend, told and retold as proof of her resilience. For Matilda, it was both triumph and tragedy. She had saved herself, but not her crown. The war dragged on, hope flickering, destiny deferred. In the snow that night, she preserved her life, but the throne of England continued to slip further from her reach. For all her battles, all her escapes, and all her unshakable determination, Matilda never wore the crown of England. At her height of power, she was addressed as Lady of the English, a title heavy with promise, yet cruelly hollow. It was recognition without fulfillment, a crown without jewels, authority without permanence. This title carried a bitter irony. It acknowledged her claim but denied her coronation. The English barons, ever pragmatic and often opportunistic, gave her just enough legitimacy to keep their options open, but never enough to settle the matter once and for all. To them, she was useful, not indispensable. The people, meanwhile, remained wary. Tales of her severity had spread widely. Chroniclers accused her of arrogance, of demanding tribute from Londoners as though they were already her subjects. In a kingdom weary of war, her unyielding pride was painted as tyranny. Where a male king's firmness might have been seen as strength, in Matilda it was interpreted as cruelty. And so, despite moments when the throne was within reach, Matilda was pushed back again and again. Fate seemed to conspire against her. Betrayal among allies, shifting loyalties of barons, the unrelenting grip of Stephen's faction. The dream her father had fought to secure for her dissolved into ashes. Her title, Lady of the English, remained both a badge of honor and a mark of defeat. It signified her place in the struggle, but reminded her daily of the crown that slipped from her hands. For Matilda, the weight of an unclaimed throne became not just a political burden, but a personal torment. History remembers her as the queen who was never crowned. And in that absence, in that void where her coronation should have been, lies the essence of her tragedy. If Matilda could not rule in her own right, she would rule through her blood. Her eldest son, Henry Plantagenet, inherited both her ambition and her resilience. From his father Geoffrey, he received the lands of Anjou and Normandy. From his mother, the iron will to fight for England's crown. Matilda poured her energy into securing his future. Where her own attempts had faltered, Henry would succeed. She negotiated tirelessly, built alliances, and groomed her son to be the king she could never be. Her failures became his lessons, her defeats his foundation. By 1153, after years of exhausting war, the tide finally shifted. Stephen, worn down by conflict and weakened by the death of his own heir, recognized Henry as his successor. The Treaty of Winchester sealed the compromise. Stephen would remain king until his death, but the crown would pass to Matilda's son. In 1154, Henry was crowned as King Henry II of England. With that coronation, the Plantagenet dynasty was born, a dynasty that would rule for over 3 centuries, shaping the destiny of England and Europe. It was a triumph that belonged as much to Matilda as to her son. Yet there was bitterness in her victory. The crown had passed over her head to rest on her child's. She had fought, bled, and suffered for a throne she never touched. But through Henry, her legacy was undeniable. He was her vindication, proof that her struggle had not been in vain. In her son's reign, the world would remember the woman who made it possible. Not as queen, not as empress, but as the mother who endured exile, betrayal, and defeat so that her bloodline could wear the crown she was denied. It was not the destiny she had dreamed of. but it was the legacy she secured. The final years of Matilda's life were far removed from the battlefields and political storms that had defined her youth. She withdrew to Normandy, a quieter existence compared to the chaos she had endured. Yet even in retreat, peace did not fully embrace her. Matilda suffered from recurring fevers, thought to be malaria, which left her body weakened over time. These fevers gave way to sores and lesions, afflictions that ravaged her skin and tormented her with constant pain. Chroniclers noted her declining health with grim detail. The Empress, once crowned in grandeur, was now fading, her body marked by illness, her strength drained day by day. At 65, she had outlived her father, her first husband, her rival Stephen, and countless allies and enemies. But survival was not victory. It was endurance. Her life became a long twilight of reflection, a mixture of pride in her son's reign and sorrow for the crown she had never worn. On September 10, 1167, in Rouen, Normandy, Matilda breathed her last. There was no triumphant cortege, no universal mourning across England. Her death was marked with dignity, but not the grandeur reserved for crowned monarchs. She was buried at the Abbey of Bec-Hellouin, far from Westminster, far from the throne she had once fought so fiercely to claim. Her epitaph read simply, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring," a line that honored her lineage and her role as mother, but carefully avoided the title she had pursued all her life. In that absence, just as in her lifetime, lay the quiet tragedy of Matilda. Matilda's story endures not because she ruled, but because she fought. She was denied her crown, yet she carved her name into the chronicles of England through persistence and defiance. Her tragedy was that of promise unfulfilled. A woman chosen to be queen, remembered only as a claimant. And yet, her legacy was far from hollow. Through her son Henry II, she became the matriarch of the Plantagenet dynasty, a line that would dominate English history with figures like Richard the Lionheart and King John. The blood of Matilda coursed through the veins of kings, her ambition echoing in their reigns. Still, the shadow of her own life lingers. She is remembered as imperious, often cold, but also unbreakable. Her escape from Oxford in the snow, her title as Lady of the English, and her unrelenting resolve against betrayal all paint the portrait of a woman ahead of her time, yet confined by it. Her death from illness, her body ravaged by sores, mirrors her life, a constant struggle against forces beyond her control. In the end, she became a symbol of endurance rather than triumph, a warning that power promised is not always power delivered. Matilda remains a paradox, denied the crown, yet mother of kings, rejected in life, yet vindicated in legacy. Her story whispers across centuries, reminding us that history's greatest tragedies are not always about defeat on the battlefield, but about victories never claimed, crowns never worn, and destinies denied.